Welcome back to Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here with what you might call a prerequisite video, at least a prerequisite for me to provide context to both upcoming content and old content, especially for those of you that have just joined us on this new 30,000 subscriber milestone. Really hitting those D-rank Social Blade numbers now. Whatever the case, thanks for hitting that subscribe button, whether it was 2 days ago, 2 years, 6 years. Appreciate you coming along for the ride. But there's one topic that I don't really tend to opine upon too much on this channel, which is weird considering it's a heavy metal guitar channel, and that is the guitars themselves. I'm more gear-based, and as my long-form deep dive content has continued to evolve, I've placed less and less importance on the individual instruments used, as generally the stars of the show is an amplifier or a pedal or whatever we're taking a look at that day. Now, it's not like I never film myself playing guitar, but quite frankly, it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine when I'm looking for something specific like, say a new pedal or an amplifier head, and 90% of the camera shots are of the guitar player. I don't give a damn. I love that you can play well, good for you, but I want to see the settings on the amplifier, so I try to reflect what I want to see in my own content. But I could see how that may have caused another issue in that, well, if you don't see what I'm playing every video, some of you may not even know what guitars I play throughout my entire channel. So hopefully this video, and potentially others like it, if you guys want to see more in this series, let me know, will lift the fog of war on some of the choices I use for different tones. And I want to start with the workhorses of Scythe Studios, I suppose you could call them, where you will hear these guitars a disproportionate amount compared to all the other ones I use, because they are really good at the one or two things they do. They are kind of the quintessential definition of that guitar, at least that class of guitar, and probably cover a decent ground of similar guitars where even if you don't have this exact same body style or exact same pickup configuration, if you use something tangentially related to it, you can expect to get a very similar sound whenever I'm playing through a certain piece of gear. So you'll kind of see a pattern as to why I've chosen those guitars that I have, why they kind of tackle individual spectrums of what I generally play in terms of tones. There is certainly overlap between all of them, but all my workhorse instruments do one or two really unique things compared to all the other ones that cannot be substituted, and that's why I keep them around. So let's start with arguably the most metal looking of the bunch, the Wild Audio Blood Eagle. Like a few guitars on this list, I actually made a review for this video when I bought it brand new about 5 years ago at this point, and it continues to be my six-string slayer for the kinds of down-tuned or even 80s thrash tones that you might hear plugged straight into the front of something like a Hot Rodded Marshall or a Tube Screamer boosted rectifier, or indeed any flavor of 5150 tones. If it has something to do with a Gibson scale length active pickup configuration, you're probably hearing this on the bridge pickup. And with the 85 in the neck, it of course does those really nice fat solo tones, though for demonstration purposes, I rarely take advantage of that. Usually you'll hear the neck in a clean application, generally through like a solid state sound, or maybe even a Fender clean sound, but something that is really loud, maybe even slightly compressed, but just to show that whatever clean application I'm using it in isn't going to break up even when using something that's fairly high output like this. Now, as far as the channel is concerned, there's a few things that I really like about this guitar that make me grab it basically first thing for your, I guess, radio-friendly metal sounds. This is kind of that mid-2000s, even late 90s machine when it comes to the kind of sounds I think of when you hear boosted dual rectifier or plug straight into a block letter 5150, or in the case of Zakk Wylde, a Tube Screamer or Super Overdrive boosted JCM 800 style platform, because of the high output, slightly compressed, slightly peaky vocal mid-sounding pickups that still manage to sound high fidelity. One challenging aspect of covering that wide variety of guitar sounds is that basically on a per song basis, the tuning changes. And I especially try to go out of my way to use riffs that not everybody else is using. Of course, I want to use a few here and there that, yeah, you've heard them a million times, but generally only if they're like that perfect spice for whatever tonal soup I'm trying to make for that video. Most of the time, though, I tried to vary it up in terms of tuning and even keys and whatever palette of sounds I'm going for. I want it to sound different and have a different style. So I'm constantly taking this thing from E standard down to B standard, even open C to drop A, and this guitar can handle it even without a string change, even without messing with the bridge setup or the truss rod. I can just basically throw whatever I want at it with something like the Ernie Ball skinny top, heavy bottom strings, and I can be confident that it's going to sound good. And, it's not going to sound like you've tuned a 80 gauge string up too high when you have this in, a Metallica tuning, or it's not going to sound like a wet noodle flapping around when I'm trying to play something like Nile on here. As many of you know, and for those that don't, you're going to see a lot of evidence for this soon, I prefer a lockdown tuning mechanism whenever possible. Not just locking tuners, but something like a Floyd Rose nut and a fine tuning bridge system. It just makes sense if you're going to stay in one tuning for the majority of the time. But where I'm not on this instrument, and I'm not going to go modify it for that, I definitely have to rely on the stability of the whole system itself. And despite being just a plain Jane tune-o-matic bridge and a nut that I definitely have to grease and I've had to file on a couple strings to get them from pulling, it does a surprisingly good job of holding intonation, even when bouncing back and forth between different tunings. It's no more than probably a minute to go from drastically, different sounds to be able to dial them in and make sure the pitches are rock solid before I, get on with my recording. Now, none of these are features that you couldn't find on a decently built Gibson style guitar. It's probably not going to come from Gibson, but there are a couple things on here that you don't see on your everyday Explorer knockoff. So the neck, being this raw kind of satin finish, does definitely help with playability. It is far better than my Epiphone Les Paul, which has, the typical glossy finish on the back. It never gets sticky. I don't feel like I ever have to use any chemicals or, any aids to make this any slicker. Just a decent microfiber cloth, and this is, as fast as I'd ever need it to be. It has a pretty chunky grip to it. Some friends that have played this guitar definitely remark on how chunky and thick the neck feels to them, but with the tunings I play on it and the string spacing, it does feel kind of right at home for me, and I don't feel really limited in any of the fret reach. Yeah, 24 frets would be great for a lot of contemporary material, but for a lot of the chugging and riffing that I do for demonstrations, I don't really need that anyway. Of course, the fretboard is something that is totally up to personal preference, as is the entire aesthetic choice of the Wild Audio brand. As I remarked on the review for this guitar, the aesthetic choices are going to be polarizing, of course. I really dig the shape of this. I like what they did to the Explorer shape. It's not overly gaudy. It's just gaudy enough to be fun, in my opinion. I like the little hooks, even if they are dent magnets. And I think this is something that you could walk up on any metal band stage, cover up the W, and no one's going to think, oh, that's a Zakk Wylde guitar, right? I mean, the Black Label Society doesn't look out of place playing these, but this also doesn't just scream, oh, Bullseye or some of the other abominations that come out of the Wild Audio brand. Whatever the case, I think this one looks really nice with the, black on kind of natural binding. It's not totally overdone. It's borderline overdone, but with the big block inlays on an ebony fretboard and contrasting with the natural wood grain, I think this is going to be a package that really holds up over the next few decades, much like the EMGs that are equipped. So it makes for a really nice, homogeneous guitar story. When I was looking to purchase the Blood Eagle, I of course had my own personal motivations, but as far as the channel was concerned, I wanted something that was an equal opposite to the guitars I'd already owned. Something that already had a Gibson scale length and passive guitars, well, I wanted its evil twin with EMGs. That way I could do the vintage tones and, the open passive sounds on that guitar, and then the more contemporary, or at least at the time contemporary, not Fishman Fluence contemporary sounds on this one. And when it came to the extended range side of things, I had the opposite issue where my 8 strings all had active pickups and I was looking for something with passive pickups, which brings me to possibly the piece de resistance of the channel, the NOF Super Typhoon. It's hard to believe the journey that led to this guitar's creation began merely months after purchasing the Blood Eagle. And it's even harder to believe that I've had this guitar for over 4 years now, because every time I pick it up, it feels like it just got here. Like I just unboxed it that morning, because it is such a special instrument. You've heard this guitar on a couple songs on Scythe, Children of the Stars. You hear this in basically any video that you hear a down-tuned 7 or 8 string sound that doesn't have a purely active pickup sound going for it. So you probably hear this at least once or twice a video. And the reason for that is because I love it. This is the 8 string I was searching for basically my whole life up until that point. And while I would love to have more 8 string and potentially maybe one day 9 or 10 strings, if that made sense for compositional purposes, to complement this, there is not a single instrument in the world that I would rather have over this guitar for everything that we set out to do with it, for everything I wanted it to be able to achieve. It achieves that and way more. So there is a multi-part video series on this guitar that is between 4.5 and 5 years old at this point. It details the kind of design of it, me purchasing the parts initially and then asking for, different custom guitar makers to design guitars around them, with the input of me, of course, having my own sketches and, basic CAD models. And it turned into this beautiful design, which has kind of a hodgepodge of some of the best features of all my favorite 8 strings out there. You certainly see, the influence of certain big brands out there. And for the few of you that aren't already aware of my 10 out of 10 Meshuggah fanboy status, Lundgren M8, just like Friedrich and Morton, the ABM custom 8-string Tune-o-matic fine-tuning bridge that's seen on a couple of Friedrich's guitars, as well as Ian Kidman's guitars. The Floyd Rose locking nut that you'll see on Friedrich and Morton's standard guitars, the same tuners they use, very similar neck profiles to a lot of the Ibanez 8 strings out there, because I wanted something that was quite a bit different from the 8 strings I already had. And it has a bit of a flat plane in the center, but then kind of a chunkier, I would say, Gibson style radius on the edges. And it actually really works because it gives some really nice thumb reinforcement. Once again, I've had people say this thing feels like a tank, but I have a guitar with an even wider neck and thicker neck. So this feels really comfortable to me. String spacing is perfect for what I wanted, and it plays like an absolute dream. And that is, of course, thanks to Onofre Garcia, who spent so much time on this instrument, and I can't wait to show you what he's working on next. But as far as 7 and 8 string tones go, this is my #1 choice for the channel, and indeed personal music. For the 28-inch scale length, despite having one guitar that is longer, and I just prefer the texture of the lower two strings on passive pickups more often than not. I especially feel with the kind of tones I try to demonstrate a lot of the time with extended range sounds, this gives a better snapshot of what the gear is doing, because this does have a bit more of a vintage vibe. It is still djenty, right? It still has that really percussive sound, but it doesn't really saturate all the equipment as much as something like EMGs or Fishman Fluences do, in my experience, and it just sounds a little bit more transparent. It also sounds more aggressive to me in certain ways, a little more raw, is how a lot of people would describe it. And I prefer that. You know, with the kind of music I want to play on here, I don't really want that octane-friendly, you know, edited to death, Kemper profile, refined, multi-band compressed thing. I'm not really interested in that. This harkens back to more of the late 90s, early 2000s, when bands were still really experimenting with extended range guitars, plugging into more traditional kind of rigs and just seeing what happens. But by the time the manufacturers really got a grip with production 7 and 8 string guitars, a lot of the bands had moved to digital solutions and signal chains that didn't necessarily involve the old school analog gear. So my goal with this guitar was to be able to evoke all those sounds, play nice with it, but without feeling sterile or that different from a regular 6-string guitar of old. And I think this does a really good job balancing that. So for the recording side of things, what I like when I sit down to make, you know, DIs for different shootouts or gear demonstrations is the rock solid tuning. I can very easily drop the B flat and F strings down to A flat and E flat for some combination of open or, you know, drop tunings, and it still holds stable with the 70 gauge, and I believe it's a 54 I'm using currently on the B string. B flat, I half step down on this guitar. And thanks to the fantastic bridge setup, the intonation is ridiculously good. And if, you know, a string goes out, it's really easy to hit a chord and, you know, do it individually. So that really helps the recording side of things. This, of course, also has coil splitting on each one. I don't tend to use that too much, sometimes on the neck and in the center position, some combination thereof for either like a thumpy, grindy kind of sound or a clean single coil sound when I don't want that, you know, kind of compressed, sanitized sound that you get out of Fishman Fluences for that. Most of the time, though, you're going to hear this guitar on the bridge pickup, just like with the Blood Eagle, non-coil splitted, and I try to take advantage of damn near all the strings whenever I can, because why buy an 8-string? Just buy a baritone 6-string tuned down if that's all you're going to use it for. But yeah, I like all 8. next guitar is the only one of this bunch that I had prior to the creation of the channel, and it is one that never really saw too much action in the earliest days of Plague Scythe Studios, but I found its home in terms of the tonal spectrum that I cover over the next couple of years, and I've definitely featured it more predominantly as time has gone on. This is the Gibson SGJ. It's not a junior, but it's also not really a full-blown SG in the traditional sense either. It's a little weird. The proportions aren't 100% the same as a regular SG when it comes to like the pickup spacing, especially on the neck side, but it is still undoubtedly SG because it has that same kind of snappy, bright kind of sound that you would associate with them, and especially as far as the feel goes compared to my other Gibson scale length guitars and my other SG style guitar. But it also has its own thing going on as well, and I believe that has a lot to do with the atypical neck wood selection, as well as the just the overall kind of stripped back nature of this guitar. In particular, I find these patent applied for styled pickups to be really sizzly, not in a negative way, but not nearly as, I guess, honky as I would generally associate them being in a normal SG or especially a regular Les Paul style guitar. And this has a bit more of a I guess a raw, stonery kind of sound as a result, and that is what I fell in love with when I picked this guitar up. I can remember the weekend I got it because it was a Labor Day special at Guitar Center, and so still when they would send out flyers regularly, stuff in the mail, and that was one of the promotions. It was like $550, and there's no way there's selling a Gibson of any kind for that low amount of money. That sounds laughable by today's standards, especially. But went in, checked it out, and I liked it for every reason that I didn't like stock SGs, because it just had more balls, quite frankly, despite the dot inlays and kind of the stripped back nature of it, the satin bridge and all that. Something about it really grabbed me. And it probably didn't hurt that I was listening to a lot of Sabbath Volume 4 and Sabotage while grinding Titanfall around that time. So probably a little Pavlovian response with this guitar shape, but I loved it, and I'm really glad that I made that decision, because this has been a truly fun guitar, and it makes me play like no other one makes me play. Even other Gibson scale length guitars where I want to do something maybe more vintage sounding, maybe more dad rock, or if I did go on the heavier side, it would still be the kind of Les Paul friendly radio stuff you would hear, right? Most something like Alter Bridge, or like a Tremonti style distortion sound, where this one makes me want to play a little more, I don't know, rockabilly-ish, stoner-ish, and even proggy to a certain extent, which is weird out of a guitar like this. And I think it does have to do with the overall different sound that you get out of this compared to a standard SG. This was the guitar that made me decide to go full force on the locking nut and fine-tuning bridge concept for the 8-string. And despite some people clamoring that, oh, you're going to ruin the guitar by drilling this Kaler into there, why didn't you just change this, get a string butler, blah, blah, blah. Well, Mr. Keyboard experts, this is held up fine. It's not a magical device. It's screws going through wood. You don't drill the wrong way, break off a headstock, it's going to be good. And it's held up just fine these past few years. Totally glad I did that. And this is one of those guitars where I don't feel bad doing that. And that's another reason I like it. Kind of just like the Blood Eagle. While that one was a fair bit more expensive than this guitar, over twice as expensive, in fact, this isn't something I feel sick to nick, right? I've got some, wear there, there's some buckle rash on the back. Who gives a shit? It's a fun guitar to play. It sounds gnarly. And this is just like that equivalent of, the guitar just gets punched in the face. That's all you got, bring it on. And that's what I really like about this instrument. One common theme you'll see running across all my so-called workhorse guitars is the dynamics you get out of the bridge pickup sound, whether it be the active versus passive technology, the position itself, the relative position compared to the bridge, and the overall scale length. That is really the core difference when it comes to the metal guitar rhythm sound, as generally that's what we're using, the bridge position going into whatever highly distorted circuit we're plugging into. And so I want all my workhorse guitars to cover a lot of ground, but do different things compared to the other ones. And as we've gotten progressively, I guess, more traditional, more passive, less precise and more raw, I guess it makes sense to leave off on our least metal entrant with the modern player Telecaster from Fender. Crafted in China, of course, and it basically had to have been for the 550 plus tax price point. Oddly similar to the SGJ, which I'd purchased approximately 4 years prior to getting this guitar. And both of those guitars, just for context, cost less than the Blood Eagle did by itself. And I think between those two, you'll see a lot of capability, a lot of ground covered. And that's just kind of what you can expect as prices increase and you get less for your money in terms of functionality, but get more in the way of aesthetics or uniqueness or whatever you're looking for. Maybe it's just a brand. But especially 5 or 10 years ago, if you were more willing to go to the bargain end of even name brand guitars, you could probably get a lot more bang for your buck. And this was one such guitar. And it's funny because I kind of purchased this as a utilitarian tool, basically to fill in the gaps for the instruments that I already had. And I could get a lot of similar Telly-ish type tones, or at least Fender type tones, with coil splits or using a certain mode on an active pickup. But most of the time, it just didn't quite feel the same, and it really didn't sound the same. And you can chalk that up to frequency response differences, output levels being too high, whatever the case is. It didn't sound like this kind of guitar. And it wasn't just for the outright cleans or tube screamer going through a Fender clean channel. I wanted that kind of super strat 80s sound as well to be able to cover, overdriven plexis tones or, JCM 800, more transparent Marshall kind of 80s rock sounds. And I wasn't really getting that with my Gibson scale length guitars, even the passive ones. But I also wanted something that did a little bit more traditional Fender stuff as well. And I did have a budget strat option, but wasn't something that I really wanted to rely too heavily on given the budget nature of the instrument and the noise problems that accompanies it. So when I found this, that not only offered the typical bolt-on Fender construction, but a maple fretboard to boot, something I did not have at the time, your typical Telecaster neck pickup, but also an offering of a Stratocaster middle pickup for blend options, and of course this coil splittable humbucker in the bridge. Well, it basically solved everything I was looking for at the time, as I'd borrowed a Godin recently when I was looking at this guitar, and that was kind of the configuration I settled on wanting. I didn't want the Ibanez sound where you're coil splitting the neck humbucker and blending it with the middle single coil, and it always feels kind of, well, Ibanez-y. It doesn't really sound like any other guitar. I specifically wanted that neck single coil sound. It was something I was lacking for demonstration purposes, but being able to have the middle pickup has unlocked all sorts of other demonstration doors for me. And of course, you get this kind of pseudo superstrat sound out of this as well. The coil split works okay, but it doesn't sound like a Telly because the angle is different and it's just a coil split. You never get quite the same sound anyway. But what I did not expect was to be able to really learn to love this instrument because it is so different. It feels like I guess, a really stripped down vehicle where there's just this one-on-one engagement where you were in control of every aspect of it. It doesn't feel very refined. It doesn't feel like all the systems are really designed as part of one system where I pick up my Blood Eagle or pick up my Typhoon and feel like, yeah, this is one rock solid instrument. Everything is working in tandem, and if you remove one part of this, it's no longer this system. This feels more like a resto mod coming out of some yahoo's garage, but it's being sold by Fender. stock this way. And that's really interesting. And I don't say that in a derogatory sense, because it does feel like they learned some things here and is offering something that people want. This is just like the, well, you want to go a little crazy package? Well, here's the overclockers edition. Here's the, modded out of the box edition. And I really like that because it does feel special in that way. It feels like you're getting more out of it than you should be allowed to. And I like that. It very much feels like you're skirting the lines of what should be legal for a Telecaster. And in that way, it feels like the Telecaster for me. Would I like a blonde butterscotch, maybe even a rosewood fingerboard with the traditional setup? Yeah, potentially for some projects. But for what I do on this channel and the kind of sounds I go for, this has been a godsend. And that's all I've got for this guitar story time. For the content that you listen to on this channel, those 4 guitars produce a vast majority of it, though there are certainly some more oddballs here and there that make their contributions as well. So if you'd like to see videos on those, let me know down below. I'll consider that. And there's certainly other categories we could cover if there's interest. We got bass guitars. I got acoustic guitars spread out among different locations. I'd have to start digging for pawn shop rescues, the channel starter guitars, the ones that I started learning on. There's all kinds of different lenses we could look through this on. So let me know what the interest is. And with that, we will see you next time. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.